get started.
Right.
Welcome everybody to our first plenary panel session. We moderated by Mr. David Berteau. He is, oh, by the way, please don't be shy about asking questions. We have a Q&A chat line for you to use, so don't put it in the chat, put it in Q&A, and then I'll be asking the questions after the presentations are complete. So Mr. Berteau became the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Professional Services Council on March 28, 2016. His prior assignment was as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness in December 2014. Prior to that, he served as the Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Berteau, over to you.
Thank you, Admiral Lewis, and thanks to everybody for joining us here today. I want to in particular thank the Navy Postgraduate School and the Acquisition and Research Program, and I think also Dave, your Warfare Center as well, which is a really, I know it's a combination, a bit of fortuity, but I think it's a tremendous asset for putting on this program every year. I think it is unique in its attempt to combine real research, relevant research, with both programmatic and national security issues writ large. And it's a very capable and competent group of people that you have that contribute to it. I look forward to a number of the panels. I actually wish I could be there for all of them and divide up. And I'm hoping we can come back and watch some of the others later. And in particular, our panel this morning kind of rises up a level to really look at a question of new priorities and familiar challenges. When we proposed this panel, there were a number of challenges that we didn't see coming. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, inflation, not only in America and worldwide, but in particular in the defense business, and the election dynamics that we face today. But we knew there would be both twists on familiar challenges and new priorities coming into play. We'll open this up with a bit of a slide presentation, and then we have a tremendous panel to address some of these questions and topics. Most of you just heard Andrew Hunter, who's the Air Force Assistant Secretary, and of course, a longtime supporter and participant in these annual symposiums. And he talked a lot about the familiar challenges, starting with nuclear modernization on down to how do you bring innovation and technology into systems and how do you do it faster. I call these familiar challenges because these have been dynamics that have affected the DoD budget and resource allocation process for decades, if not longer. DoD is in constant competition for resources internally amongst all the components and the ideas, externally with the White House as the budget is put together and oftentimes as it's being defended, and of course with the Congress to both obtain the resources and then to use them properly. But even within just the familiar challenges, the existing challenges, that competition's intense. And there's more priorities than there are dollars, there always are. But the addition of new priorities by any administration only intensifies that competition. So the question that we ask ourselves this morning, the core question is, how will these new priorities, or will these new priorities, fit into the struggle to resource the responses necessary for what I call the familiar challenges? So it's a real privilege to be back here this morning, of course, and none of this would be happening without the incredible team, Dave Lewis, that you have together, Carrie Schaefer and Nadia Greer, Michelle Johnson, all the rest. We're so grateful for their excellent work. And I would like also to mention a tribute to a great friend of mine for more than 3 decades. That's retired Admiral Jim Green, who's always seen the importance not only of this symposium, but also of the critical role that excellent focused research plays in defense acquisition, in programs and resources, and essentially in defending America and freedom around the world. So my thanks have to conclude with a hearty thank you to Admiral Green, and I know all of you on the participants who know him will join me in that thanks. I am joined this morning by an excellent panel. David Norquist, who's the President and CEO of NDIA, and a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, and of course, a lot of things before that. Shannon Hines, who's the Senior Vice President at Textron, and former staff director of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and Eric Chewning, a partner with McKinsey and Company, former Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Industrial policy, although I think that title kept changing over and over again, but industry is always in it as far as that goes. So we're going to start this morning with the short slide presentation, and then we'll have commentary from each panelist, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions. You don't need to wait until we open it up. If you've got questions, go ahead and type them in the chat or in the quick Q&A box now so that they'll be ready when we want to go forward there. So let me bring up the first slide, please, James. Switch my own Zoom to, there we go. All right, so this is the title. Let's go on to the next one. So we start with money, because without dollars, there's no allocation of resources for priorities, either for contracts or for the rest of what DoD does. And I don't have a lot of particular comments to say. I've got three main points to say on this. What you see is actually the appropriations for each fiscal year, all the way back to FY11 up through FY22, with on the right-hand side, the president's budget request for FY23 and an FY23 column that has question marks in it because we don't yet have either a target number or numbers or a target date for that. I go back to FY11 because that is the last year of appropriations before the Budget Control Act caps went into effect. And the 10 years between FY12 and FY21 constitute the 10 years of BCA caps. There's three key points about those caps. Number one is they changed every 2 years. So there was a 2-year deal each time, 12 and 13, 14 and 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Each 2-year deal made modifications to the caps. The changes were connected. Increases in defense tended to be matched by increases in civilian agencies and vice versa in the early years here. And those 2-year deals, an interesting dynamic happened. We always focus this as a cap, as a ceiling above which you cannot go. And that was a big factor in building budgets and allocating resources. But what happened over time is the ceilings also became the floor. It essentially became the number you knew you were going to end up at, even though you didn't know when or how you were going to get there or how it's going to be divided up. And so what this slide shows is broken down basically into two categories. The blue at the bottom is defense. The gray at the top is non-defense, mostly civilian agencies. A little OCO sprinkled in between, 2 levels of OCO. The big one that you can see, which is the light blue, that's the defense OCO. The little one at the top, which is really just a number almost indecipherable at this scale, which is the civilian area OCO. You'll note that in FY21 is the last year with OCO. But something changed here. When we reached FY22, the caps were no longer in place. Many of us had been waiting 10 years for the caps to no longer be in place. But the problem is we had no ceiling. We also had no floor. And so we went into the FY22 budget negotiations without any agreement on the number or the distribution or the allocation of those, and with no agreement on the second year of that. We got through it, big increase in defense, big increase in civilian agencies, commensurate with history. When defense goes up, civilian agencies go up in order to get the deal. And of course, the president's budget for FY23 continues that increase. None of us expect that FY23 final will be that lower column on the right-hand side. But that, by the way, is where we are likely to start if we begin the year under a continuing resolution. And we have begun every fiscal year except one on this whole slide under a CR. The only year that was an exception was FY19, and even that was only for 6 of the cabinet departments, not the whole federal government. So the absence of caps make us focus 1 year at a time, and that's bad for DoD, it's bad for governing, and it's bad for America. Why is that? Let's go to the next slide. Part of the reason is because we're never doing just one budget at a time. When you do 1 year at a time, you're only focusing on one. This shows you kind of a simplistic version of the concurrent budget processes that DoD undertakes. Right now, today, we are spending FY22 and a lot of prior year appropriations for 2-year money or procurement money or ship construction money or MILCON money. So we're spending the budget that we have, the appropriations that we have, either current or previous years. On the Hill, the administration is defending and Congress is beginning the steps to finalize the FY23 numbers, right? So the agencies are explaining their requests and Congress is starting to work towards authorizing and appropriating those funds. And inside the department, I mean, it's May. They're already well along with assembling the FY24 budget and the associated future year defense program that goes with it. One of the great strengths of DoD is a fiscally disciplined, long-term resource allocation and planning process. It's unmatched anywhere else in the federal government. It's actually unmatched almost anywhere else in the world. And it requires a lot of attention going forward but it also means that if you're only working 1 year at a time, you're really at a disadvantage with these concurrent budget processes. And until you get to very high levels within the department, there's very little institutional connectivity among or between these three different lines and processes that are in place there, even though they're totally mutually dependent on one another as they go through the process. Let's look at what it means if it's 1 year at a time. Next slide, please. This is kind of the timeline of what to watch. There's today on the left-hand side, very nicely placed in big and blue. And you can see, we're going through the rest of the calendar year, which is the black part, but we're not very far away. In fact, I think June, July, August, September, we are only about 4.5 months away from the start of fiscal year 23. And of course, I think it's almost a guarantee that we'll be starting that year, that fiscal year under a continuing resolution. The only question is how many of them and for how long they will go. And meanwhile, the 24 budget's being built. I put the OMB passbacks in here. They're often less relevant for DoD than they are for the rest of the federal government. But one big way in which the passback has an impact is the inflation target that gets built into the FY24 budget. And of course, a big driver here up at the top is kind of external stuff, not internal stuff, is the midterm elections in November 8th, the outcome of which will have a lot to do with whether we get a CR that ends in December with a full year appropriation, or whether, as so many times has happened after an election, that moves on into calendar year 2023 and may well overlap and impact with the submission of next year's budget. But that's the process by which all the familiar challenges are dealt with. Let's look at the new priorities. Next slide, please. This is just a list of some executive orders. I think there have been 88 executive orders signed by President Biden since taking office on January 20th. And that's as of May the 1st. I haven't updated it for this week yet. And then we pick a few out. And the ones we've picked out here are primarily the ones that, from PSC's point of view, have great interest and potential impact on defense and defense contractors. Why? Because almost all of these executive orders have a clause or a sentence or a paragraph or a whole page on changes to be made in the federal acquisition regulation that will in fact drive changes in contracts and contractor behavior. And that level of attention, I would tell you in my experience, is at a higher ratio in terms of both the number of executive orders and the number of executive orders that are going to use contracting and acquisition and procurement as a mechanism of driving these priorities into the system, into the government, into the DoD, and into the contractors that support the government across the board. I'm not going to dwell on them, but if you look down the list, you'll see quite a number of familiar topics there. Made in America, pay raises, implementation of infrastructure, supply chain issues, but climate crises, equity and inclusion and diversity across the board, changes at a much broader social level than typically the federal acquisition regulations are used for. Next slide, it shows you it's more than just executive orders. There's 70 presidential memoranda, 249, I'm sure it's more than that now, proclamations, 47 presidential notices, and these are some of the areas that impact us. This is what I think of as the new priorities, even though some of them, like supply chain issues in microelectronics or forgings and castings, have been around for decades. Eric, I know you wrestled with them in responding to a previous executive order some years ago. So they're not new challenges, but they are changing and the dynamics are changing. So now let me have one more slide. After all of that, here's where that money goes in terms of contract obligations. I just have 2 slides here. This is DoD total contract obligations by fiscal year. I only go back to 17. We can go back as far as you want for research purposes. Well, not as far as you want, but we can go back into the 90s. And it's by quarter, by fiscal quarter. And you do see in FY19 a very interesting first quarter bump. That's the year we had a full year appropriation in August, and DoD was not suffering under the constraints. Dave Norquist, I remember you saying once about a meeting you had where all of the comptrollers across DoD said, hey, we don't need new guidance on CRs. We know how to do that. What we don't know how to do is how do we operate if we actually start the fiscal year on time with a full year appropriation in place? Well, it turns out we actually do know how to obligate contracts. And if you look at that, you actually have a smoother delivery of contracts across each quarter. It's more regulated, it's more normalized, you get stuff sooner. There's a lot of advantages that are demonstrated just in that one fiscal year. Big jump in fiscal year 20. That's not because it's partly because appropriations went up, but it's really driven by COVID expenditures that were supplemental funds in the CARES Act. And then that drop in FY21 is partially driven by COVID decreasing And it's partially driven by the cessation of activity in Afghanistan and the ending of a lot of contract obligations and expenditures in Afghanistan in 21. And you see pretty flat in FY22. First quarter, DoD takes 90 days to release data, so I don't have second quarter data, even though they do. I used to think they did something with it during those 90 days. Then I went back to the Pentagon and discovered they really just sit on it. And it'd be great if it were released. Let me break it down, though, next slide, into contract for obligations for services on the left and for products on the right. Important fact is that roughly 50% of DoD contract obligations are for things that DoD categorizes as services. We agree with their definition, and 50% products. That's been a rubric that's been in place for a long time, well in advance of FY17. And what you see is, in particular, the bigger part of the drop, about twice as much of the drop between 20 and 21 was in products as in services. And what you see in the first quarter of FY22 is an increase in products dollars and a slight decrease in services dollars. We're looking forward to second quarter data, so we see if those trends continue. Obviously, the CRs for FY22 extended almost all the way through the second quarter as well. And so this puts a real burden on DoD to obligate one-year funds in particular before the end of the fiscal year or before the comptroller comes around and sweeps them up. Let me have one more slide. So this is our panel now. Obviously, myself as moderator, Mr. Norquist, Ms. Hines, and Mr. Chewning. So I'm going to turn to each of you in turn, and I think you can go ahead and take the slides off now. And we'll go to speaker view here. And so what I would ask is if you're on and you're not a speaker, if you would turn your video off, and I'm pretty sure your mics are muted already until the time comes for question and answer. So let me first open up with Mr. Norquist. David, I think that you've been in the position both as comptroller and as deputy secretary, where you were actually the funnel, the bottom of the funnel through which all of these competing priorities had to fold in. So walk us through a little bit how that happens and how you end up with a result that's both balanced and productive and defends America well.
Absolutely. And again, thank you everyone for joining us and for having us here today. So the first step is you have to start with the strategy, which in Department of Defense is the National Defense Strategy. And if you look at the 2018 NDS from the previous administration and the public unclassified outline of the 2022 NDS, what you see is some very common themes. So first, China is the long-term pacing challenge. Both parties, both administrations recognized that was where we were facing in the long term. Russia is recognized as the near-term acute threat. They know they're in financial difficulties compared to China. They understand that their time is short, and so therefore they're much more aggressive, much more likely to take dangerous provocations, as we've seen. Iran, North Korea, violent extremist organizations all make the list as persistent threats. But the core theme is the return to the focus on the high-end fight against countries that want to break the norms of the international order. One thing to note is we're in a very different place than we were in the past when we faced the Soviet Union or Japan or Germany, where the US economy was much larger. And we could always count in the long run of just winning through capacity, just extra capability, and we'd push them out. That's not going to be true with China. Our GDP is much more similar to theirs, but we do have some key strengths that we need to look to. And again, both of these are brought up in the National Defense Strategy. The first is allies and partners. The United States is part of a large network of allies and partners that work together. Most of these other countries who are breaking the international order are not. And we have an innovative industrial base. And as we're able to take advantage of that, it gives us a strategic advantage over those other countries. The leadership starts with this in the Department of Defense. Everyone starts with this understanding as you go in, as your services are building their budgets, as they're presenting their 5-year plans, their POMs, their 6-year programs to the department. And you get a couple of decisions early, right? You're going to decide whether you're going to fully fund the triad because of the fact that you're facing 2 nuclear powers and the importance of deterrence to being successful. You look at the scale of the Pacific and you start realizing your need for long-range strikes. In addition to those, you're looking at what are the emerging technologies that are going to disrupt, that are going to provide us opportunities. Heidi Shue produced her list. It was very similar to the one produced before. She added a couple of items. What you see is directed energy, hypersonics, biotechnology, quantum science, AI, autonomy, microelectronics. I think it's very reassuring that you can have different people in these positions, different administrations, and they're coming back to the same strategy and similar emerging technologies, which implies there's a stability in the strategic direction. That is very helpful to industry to understand that if you invest in a particular area, that's likely to be carried forward across time and across people. It's not necessarily true of other civilian agencies. It's not true for the Department of Homeland Security. They face a very different environment when they see a change, and that creates its own set of challenges. Now, it's useful to know where we're starting, but it's not enough to get there. You now need to consider your warfighting concept, and the joint warfighting concept, which the Joint Staff is working on to deal with anti-access and air denial challenges, creates another wrinkle in how you build it. And so here I'm just going to do a brief historical example, but it's basically the difference between the tank and the mechanized division. In World War I, the British invented the tank first. By World War II, the French had more of them, and some of them were more advanced than the Germans, but the French just put them alongside their infantry. The infantry advanced, the tank rolled next to them. It was the Germans who experimented with the different concept of tracked vehicles, combustion engines, radios, and realized that what they really need to do is to put some infantry on track, some artillery, and create these mechanized divisions. And then when there's a hole in the enemy lines, they could break through at the speed of a vehicle instead of a foot, and they could talk to each other with radios. And that dramatically changed the way the war went beyond the simple technology. The challenge we face today is everyone's chasing similar technologies, AI, hypersonics, directed energy. The real issue is going to be how they are used and combined, which puts a premium on getting the future warfighting concept right. And that pulls back into the pond because that gets to the question of force structure, basing, training, what skill sets you're developing and promoting so that over the 5 years as these technologies arrive, you can use them in different ways and the combatant commanders are able to do something more than just the value of the individual technologies. So start with the strategy, you identify the technology drivers of change. You notice that we've had very large RDT&E budgets as a reflection of that. You build in what you know about the warfighting concept, and then you're left with some very clear choices. The first one is near-term or long-term. Where do you think the greatest risk is to the United States? Where do you emphasize your investment? This shows up in the debate over divestment. If you're more concerned about the longer term, you're more willing to take risk by doing divesting to free up resources. If you're concerned a conflict could come much sooner, then you don't want to take that risk. But you'll see that as a central debate as the department goes through it. You always have a series of administration considerations that you have to work in. Some of these have a dollar value you have to accommodate. Some of them are take time and leadership energy in order to implement, but they don't have as direct effect over your funding and your balance. Typically, the department is generally very accommodating. You do report to the president, you follow their guidance, and you try and as best you can incorporate those in a way that works in connection with your overall strategy. There are several disruptions that every administration faces, particularly early on in the administration. The first one is not everyone is confirmed. Even a year into an administration, not everyone is confirmed. And that creates challenges for the leadership trying to get all the input. You're typically settling most of your decisions, for example, on FY23 without knowing the outcome of 22. You generally don't get your top line till late if there's any sort of debate with the Hill. And as always, current events cause disruptions at the most inconvenient time because the bad guys get a vote. So a very tough environment. And so at the end of the day, whether it's in December or January, or whether because of a delay it's in February, there's a certain point where there's a final meeting between the secretary, the deputy, and other advisors, and they just go over one last look. Did we get it consistent with our strategy? Are we taking advantage of the technologies? Are we executing against the concept? Where are our balances on the edge? What are the last bits of choices based on either the increase or decrease in funding? And then you lock the budget and send it to the printer, knowing full well that the moment you do, the world is going to change on you, and you're going to have to explain for the next several months something you locked down months earlier. Last week, Deputy Secretary Hicks, when she was talking at the Reagan Forum, highlighted several challenges that she still faces, and I think they're well said, and I would reinforce them. The first one is inflation, and people talk about it like it's a 23 issue, but as she pointed out, for her, it's also a 22 issue. They have fuel pricing they have to accommodate. She doesn't know whether she's going to get a timely appropriation. That CR challenge is a real setback for the Department of Defense, that instability. And if Q&A, somebody wants to go into it, I'm going to have to, I'll dwell on that. Contracting for innovation. We have new adaptive acquisition tools, but getting everyone to use them to take full advantage. We're not going to beat the Chinese by being better at central planning. So we've really got to take advantage of our industry. And lastly is the capacity of the industrial base. I think Moshe Schwartz is going to talk more about some of these challenges, but sometimes even when you want to spend more money on a project, there isn't the capacity to ramp up the production the way you need. So at the end, you start with the strategy, you make all these trade-offs as you get to the budget. And then even when you're done, you're left with some very persistent challenges that make this life hard. So with that, let me pause and we'll go to our next speaker.
All right, thank you, David. And as Andrew Hunter said, Congress gets a vote here. In fact, they get as many votes as they want with that. So Shannon, you've been for a number of years on the receiving end of the results of this marvelous process that Mr. Norquist just described. So talk a little bit about, how Congress takes a result of that executive branch integration of priorities and adds its own priorities and then enacts appropriations with usually a good dash of guidance along the way. So over to you, Shannon.
Good dash of guidance is a really good way to describe that. And I apologize, my video has gone off and I'm not sure why. So I'm not hiding in the background. Oh wait, here we go. Okay, there we go. Thanks so much. I mean, I think as Dave, you mentioned in your presentation, the uncertainty of the budget process and the overall political environment has in many cases created turmoil within federal agencies and their ability to plan and flex where necessary. And certainly that has created issues for the Department of Defense and then all of the residual industrial base actors that help the department do what it does. I think from my perspective, the budget environment has really emerged, this particular kind of budget environment has really emerged since passage of the Budget Control Act, which resulted in sequestration. And then, as you said, really resulted in kind of this regular cadence of discontent about overall spending levels, how you distribute the top line between defense funding and non-defense funding. And there are good years and bad years. I come from the Hill where that's all relative, and I definitely appreciate that. But this is, we've evolved from a place where we had to get it done. Appropriations was the one thing that got done relatively on time every single year. And in my 27 years of being on the Hill, it became that one thing that you could always count on that was always going to be at least 6 months late, if not worse. Which is unfortunate, right? It makes it difficult for agencies to plan. It makes it difficult for those that rely on federal agencies for the bulk of their work to plan. So I think there's always been this push-pull, but it has become incredibly dynamic and unpredictable since we've seen more polar opposites coming into Congress and folks not appreciating, just to be real frank, the need to compromise and work together. And while certainly a 2-year agreement sounds like a great idea and the avenue to success, I think your chart, Dave, showed that only in 1 year over the past, frankly, almost 20 years, has that been a successful path. And I think, and certainly I am biased in that it was my former boss who came in as chair of the Appropriations Committee in 2019, working with Senator Leahy, who agreed to set all of the politics and the discontent aside and just establish a baseline in order to move forward using those top line numbers. And you saw bills get passed before the end of the fiscal year for the Department of Defense. It was the first time in 10 years. So I think there is a path forward. You just have to have willing participants. And while we were successful in doing that 1 year, we weren't able to do it again. And I think this year is not going to be an outlier. It's the same. I think the same dynamic is going to occur. And there isn't a top line agreement for this year. And Ukraine has really thrown a wrench into how you move forward and address. I think it has caused a great rethinking of how we spend DoD dollars, how we categorize readiness for ourselves, and how that impacts the overall defense industrial base and our supply chain. frankly. We've talked about that for years. I think Ukraine has really helped to focus us on how can our defense industrial base and our supply chain react quickly. And I think the answer is it really can't in its current state. It's hard. It's hard to get things back up and running. So, I think the acrimony in Congress, I think CRs, all of that has added to kind of how do we have a stop-start kind of process within DoD. CRs are hard, right? But as David pointed out, right, he knows how to deal with a CR. He doesn't know how to deal with a full year bill when he was at DoD. I think we saw that the agencies learned how to address CRs. One of the things I was always confused by was the continued mantra of a CR would be devastating. A CR would cause great problems. But regardless of the administration, there was never a solution, right? Aside from pass bills on time, and that goes without saying, but there was never a real solution to how do you address a CR, right? OMB can apportion money, but what happens when it gets to the agency? I always wondered why, as opposed to just give me a giant pot of money and let me spend it how I want, when I want, why there wasn't more constructive discussion. And maybe this committee that is within DoD, I think David is a part of that. Maybe there'll be more discussion of that moving forward about how you address that going forward, because certainly DoD plans for the out years. It's just a question of what does that look like and how closely do they hew to that particular planning versus kind of gaming the system these days. So kind of enough about CRs. I did want to talk a little bit about budget proposal versus appropriations process versus budget execution, and how that truly impacts defense industrial base and supply chain, and frankly, how I see it differently now that I'm on the outside versus when I was on the hill. I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict has really kind of had folks thinking about that more in a way that they didn't previously. The administration has certainly undertaken efforts to have more Buy America, more domestic sourcing. And that's great in theory, but in reality, the investments that DoD, Vice, the private sector is making in the defense industrial base and the supply chain is limited to those investments that are made, in my view, to new technologies, right? So we're not investing or not willing to invest in maintaining legacy systems, so to speak. And there's always been this push-pull between divesting to invest. And certainly when I was on the Hill, I was a big proponent, right? You shouldn't be paying for legacy systems if you're going to get rid of them and you're not going to use them. But I think where I see the split now more acutely is that certainly if you are going to transition out a legacy system to transition in a new system, you still need to plan for how do you maintain that equipment? How do you maintain readiness? How do you ensure that if you need pieces and parts to repair, that you're not cannibalizing your existing systems, if you even have them, to cannibalize in order to maintain something that you know that you're going to need for the next 10, 15, 20 years until the new latest and greatest thing comes along. And I think that's really where kind of this discussion about domestic, the defense industrial base and the domestic supply chain comes in and is really relevant right now, right? When you let production lines go cold, totally cold, you just shut them down, getting them restarted, finding people that can do the work, finding the parts to put into that equipment becomes more and more difficult, and it increases the price for the department ultimately, and it increases the lag time. So that's longer that particular equipment is offline. So I think that's something that as we go forward, there should be more discussion and more focus on, particularly if our focus is one where we really want to onshore more of our stuff. And we really want to maintain our defense industrial base. So with that, I'll leave it and happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. That's a good, quick summary, although we could probably spend the rest of the time on any one sentence you said there as we go forward. So Eric Chewning, there's an industry side to this as well. In fact, I'm struck by David Norquist's comment about Deputy Secretary Hicks talking about the impact of inflation on DoD and citing fuel. Every single company I know who's a defense contractor is suffering from similar inflation impacts. And probably the biggest piece of that is not in the supply chain, it's in the workers, it's wage inflation. DoD doesn't use the CPI, but guess what? Workers do. And they look at what their lost earning power is, and particularly in a marketplace where there are almost twice as many job openings as there are people looking for work. It's kind of a workers' market in that situation. But above all that, industry has to participate in this process. And what's interesting is they can't really bid and win a contract until the money's been appropriated and apportioned out by OMB and flowed down to the programs. And yet industry has to watch it. Go back to my three arrows, right? The spending, the defending, and the assembling. Industry is watching it from the very early stages of the assembling process, even though they won't actually get a dollar out of it until the late stages of the spending part of the process, 2.5, 3 years later. So how does industry deal with this? How do they prepare to be able to respond to and deliver the products and services that DoD is going to need to support its missions and functions as they go through this process? And how do new priorities potentially come in and affect that? Because you've dealt with some of those.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. And also, it's great to be on a panel with you and David Norquist and Admiral Lewis and Shannon. And also, candidly, it's great to be able to connect with all of you, because all of you out there in Zoom world right now are at the kind of the coal face on this issue, and are going to be able to really impact change. And it's great to be able to get in discussion with you. Listen, I always think it's good to follow the money with any organization. Being able to follow the money kind of gives you a sense for what the priorities are. And with DoD, budgets play a really important signaling role to industry. And I think there's two elements of signaling that are really germane for this group. The first is DoD's demand signal for the type of technology or solution that it wants to buy. And as David indicated, there's an implied force structure choice here, right? I may want to buy more submarines, fewer fifth-gen tactical aircraft. Hopefully that's been informed by a joint warfighting concept as an example. And if that's the case, right, then the department is signaling we have a joint warfighting concept. The warfighting concept is impacting our force structure, it's impacting how we're thinking about technology. I'm sending a demand signal out to industry that says, I'm going to need more technological solutions that can do these types of missions. In addition to the force structure element of that, there's also a signaling around potentially specific technology requirements, right? I always think of something like rad hard microelectronics are a good example, right? We're looking for this type of requirement on our radiation hardened microelectronics. And that tells industry, all right, that's what the department wants to buy. I need to get organized around that. And that's really when we get to the second piece of the signaling. There's an implied production capacity industry needs to meet that demand. And David, as you indicated, that demand, it could be around the workforce, it could be around the supply chain, it could be around the physical assets. And what's really critical for the markets that are a monopsony, markets effectively where DoD is the only consumer, DoD's demand signal, the first element, is going to set the industry structure, because there's no one else who's going to be able to buy similar types of products, right? There aren't any other, no one else buys the type of, nuclear aircraft carriers are a classic example, right, of the size and scale of the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet. So what I would submit to this group is, I think collectively we've spent a lot of time, and when I say we, I mean the department and industry together, the broader industrial base, has spent a lot of time on that first dimension around the demand signal, the technological solution. And we have not spent enough time on number two. And since the Last Supper, at the end of the Cold War, the DoD message to industry on number two, the capacity, has been, I want a smaller workforce, I want to reduce cost overheads, I want to reduce facilities, I want to get more efficient, I want to use commercial best practices like lean, I want to leverage a global supply chain, I want to use just-in-time inventory, because all of those things are going to drive down cost. And driving down cost is important, it's a priority. But it's also left us with an industrial base that's not capacitized for a major high-intensity conflict. And I think we're seeing that play out now in real time with respect to Javelin and Stingers. And just go to the comments the CEOs of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon have made about that, right? And the lead time it's going to take to ramp up production for those weapon systems, over the next 1 to 2 years, right? And as Shannon indicated, it's not as simple as just turning on the crank at the prime level. It's the demand signal the prime needs to send all the way down the supply chain, multiple levels, and they need to make investment decisions and to meet whatever that new demand forecast is. And so I think one of the ways DoD and industry really need to partner much, much better is around the integration of war planning and industrial-based capacity planning. And just to make that tactical for everybody, here are the types of questions that we need to be asking ourselves that I don't think we could answer right now. So how long would it take DoD's material community and industry to regenerate losses from our most taxing war plans at day 10, 100, and 365, right? Real confidence around how long it would take for those replacements. Does the material community and the primes have the type of multi-level supply chain insight to begin to ask the questions around the capacity data, right? Not just at the prime level, but when you get down to tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. And if they get the data, do the PEOs have a framework that will ingest all of that information, both structured and unstructured, and then actively manage it so supplier and capacity assumptions change? It automatically updates, right? Because everybody in this Zoom knows that a supply chain is not static, it's dynamic. And so if you may take a snapshot in time, it's only good for the moment you took that snapshot. It's constantly changing. And once we've built that for a single program, do we have a way of scaling that across services and ultimately at the OSD level so that you understand the coupled effects across program supply chains, right? And so what I mean by that is, let's just take an example that may impact Indo-PACOM, right? In a high intensity fight there, you may be in a situation where you need more SM3s and you need more THAADs, right? Well, you may go and contract those from different primes, but the reality is there's a lot of commonality in the sub-tier of that supply base. So demand signal for, say, an SM3 may inadvertently crowd out a demand signal for a THAAD. And then the response is going to be back, all right, well, let's DX it. Well, you can't DX everything, folks. It's around prioritization and how that works. And so this is hard stuff, and there is not a magic solution for any of this, right? And this is going to take real thinking in terms of how do we get to that level of insight, and then candidly, how do we address the costs associated with that, right? And who's going to bear the costs associated with that? And this is a conversation, if you take it out of the defense context, that is happening everywhere where there is a multinational supply chain right now. So it's not just a DoD discussion. It's a broader discussion that's taking place across industrial enterprises. And so, but the DoD impacts are going to be unique, and they're uniquely important because they're going to drive how we think about execution on the war plan. So, sure, we have an opportunity to discuss that further, but I'll pass it back to you, David.
Eric, those are fascinating observations, and certainly everything that I see, it's almost impossible for any major defense contractor to actually know its supply chain down to the 8th, 9th, 10th tier, where the silicon is coming out of the ground or the minerals are coming out of the ground, and that makes it even more difficult. There's a lot we could spin on from yours. I will ask one more question of the other two panelists, and then Admiral Lewis, I'll open it up to questions from you and the participants here. So David Norquist and Shannon Hines, you've now heard from Eric kind of how industry thinks about that dynamic. So David, for you, how does DoD take that into account? In particular, what does DoD assume as you're building those priorities in the budget? What do you assume about industry's ability to deliver on the products and services built into that budget? And Shannon, to what extent does Congress listen to industry concerns or even be aware of industry's concerns as part of that dynamic, as what's in the president's budget and what's in the assumptions behind the president's budget and what's not? So David, first you, and then Shannon.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Whoever's the master control of my video has to undo it so I can be seen.
One of the features of Zoom is we can turn you off, but for reasons of potential embarrassment, we can never turn you back on without your permission.
Well, it says I can't because the video host has stopped it. So now you've allowed me to return. Okay. I have returned. Still says the host has prevented me from joining.
Stealth mode, David, stealth mode.
All right, I'm back. I exist. I returned from the wilderness. Excellent. All right. So when it's done right over the course of the development of the budget, there are extensive ongoing conversations between the department, the program managers, and industry to make sure, are we putting in over the 5 years, and particularly in the budget year, correct? Is it executable? Now, it's a little bit of a tricky question because no one knows exactly what was the previous year's purchase, so they have some amount of work, and there's events that happen along the way. You know, as one points out, when it goes to the Hill, they then get several months of information that people building it didn't have. So often their changes are quite rational changes to, you weren't where you thought you were going to be at the time you had to assemble it. But when it's done right, there's enough of a conversation between the acquisition community, between the program managers and industry to understand where is the program, where is the status of the parts, the supplies, the deliverable, is there backlog, are there foreign sales that are going to have an effect on what can be done. This is one of the reasons why it's so important for government and industry to meet and talk on a regular basis, because when you don't have that communication, you can have all sorts of breakdowns in the budget and the strategy. And so associations like yours, PSC, David, or ours like NDIA, that are forums that regularly bring industry, DoD, and Congress together to have that educational understanding in an ethical way is key. The bottom line is, frankly, most defense issues are not partisan. They're just really hard. And so whether it's supply chain, capacity, contract flexibility, the key is trying to put everyone in the room and work together, and then recognize that when the facts change, the answer changes, but that doesn't mean the people who put it together made a mistake. They just had different data. And when the Hill makes a change, it's not them being mean, they just had a different piece of information. And usually it's the department's program managers and the contractors who went to the Hill and explained it. So, you know, it's just a meeting moves its location. They used to be inside the Pentagon, now they're up on Capitol Hill. It's the same people having that conversation. And before we go to Shannon, I should add one point, having also been on the Appropriations Committee. When we talk about the CR, you're not talking about a problem with the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee could pass the appropriation bill on time, every time, if they were given the running room to do so. And the staff is amazing in turning things around on short notice. So part of what you're seeing is all the external pressures and decisions tying up a process that, you know, I explained to people when I was in department. When I was there, we passed the Defense Appropriations bill in July before the August recess. And they look at me like granddad's talking about riding dinosaurs to school. But the answer is you can. When you get the leadership together and they move, it moves. All right, I'll pause there.
Right. And Shannon, your comment about Mr. Shelby and Mr. Leahy getting agreement, it wasn't just the agreement between the two of them. It was getting the leadership to go along with it. That was really the remarkable exercise there. I won't ask you what we do to make that happen going forward, but back to the more narrow question. What does the Congress think about, and how do you think about industry as part of the review process that's undertaken there?
I think, you know, David is absolutely right. And he's uniquely positioned, having, you know, sat on appropriations and been inside DoD and kind of been on both sides of the equation. We on the Hill definitely did engage the department, the program manager, the contractor to understand what, you know, what had evolved, what had changed, maybe what did get taken out of the budget that shouldn't have, or what didn't get taken out that shouldn't have. And I think you see that. I mean, if you're, you know, nerdy, like I assume most of us are, right? And you read, it's like excess to need and, you know, behind schedule, all of those things, and all of those things emerged between that long lag time between when the department put the budget together and when Congress executed on it. And you even see the difference between when the House took up the appropriations bills and when the Senate took them up, right? There are remarkable differences where Senate can take some cuts that the House didn't because they didn't know about them, they didn't have time, or they hadn't emerged at that point. So it is definitely a collaborative process, right? We don't always agree, but I mean, if you look at the overall DoD budget, for me, having come from not the DoD world into the DoD world for the majority of my career, it's the only place ever where we took as fact the department's budget request and just edited it. Like, I was used to just writing a whole new thing. So, you know, I think that speaks volumes about the comity between the department and Congress and the contractors, right? Because it needs to be a collaboration so that we get things done right. I think that's ultimately what we want. And we want to make sure we're responding appropriately, and that, you know, not everybody thinks the same way, but making sure that we're thinking about things collectively, and that everybody understands what everyone else is doing.
You're muted.
Now I'm unmuted. What my mother would have given to have a mute button on me back in my childhood. So Admiral Lewis, I think we could obviously keep talking to ourselves for a long time, but let me open up for you and questions from the participants. And you're the curator here, so
Okay.
we're at your service, sir.
So first, two observations. Mr. Norquist, thank you very much for the tank Panzer Division example. That is superb. So the technology is not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. What you do with it operationally does matter. I'd point out the Soviet Union learned the same things at the same time as the Germans. Unfortunately, Stalin didn't like his smart, creative generals and executed all of them, and well, 2/3 of them anyway. So they forgot, and then they had to learn it the same way the French and the British and the Americans learned it, which would be the hard way at the end of a barrel of a gun. So, I think that's one of a couple of really superb examples of just putting the box out there is not enough. You need to know what to do with it. So thank you for that. Second thing is there was a very robust discussion about inflation in the chat. So I'm going to ask about inflation, but I want to start with my own experience with inflation, which was in the DDG 51 Arleigh Burke shipbuilding program. We bought DDG 51 in 1985 for $1.4 billion. We bought the last DDG, which turned out not to be the last DDG, in 2005, DDG 112 for $1.2 billion. And those are checkbook dollars, then your dollars, whatever, real dollars. So in 20 years, the price of the ship stayed the same or went down a little bit. And oh, by the way, DDG 112 was a much better ship than DDG 51 was. So when people tell me about inflation in defense, and the thing the program did for that was competition, multi-year procurements, and basically incentivizing the shipyards and the suppliers to keep their costs down, which they did. And my personal view is inflation is a thing which the government can control, as Eric said, in a monopsony environment. We are the customer. We dictate what we are willing to pay, and so I differentiate between real inflation and pretend inflation. I mean, during those years, the price of steel went up, price of steel went down, price of copper went up, price of copper went down, but also the labor costs went up. But the labor content in the ships went down by 25%, 30% in most cases. So yeah, the labor got more expensive, but the shipyards got better at using what they had. So I just offer that as an example. So I'll lead off with the inflation question. What can the department do today, given that we have real inflation? What are the things that you all think the department should be doing or could be doing to attack the inflation, the current inflation issue? I am a child of the 70s and 80s. I remember 13% interest rates. I remember stagflation and all that stuff. I think most of you are probably in that era also. Over.
Yeah, I came to defense in 1981 when we were at the inflation rates that we're now comparing them to as the historically ones that are higher than today. And one of the first actions that the Reagan administration took was to provide substantial additional top line funding to DoD to absorb that inflation, and created separate inflation indices that could be used for various parts of the defense budget. Of course, it took a while for that to come into play there. But before I talk about inflation, I want to turn first to David Norquist and then ask if other panelists have something to add. So David, how would you tackle this?
So I think one of the challenges is inflation was so stable for so long. I remember when I was in the private sector, you just signed a contract and there was some number less than 2% out through the fight, and you didn't worry about it. You signed a 5-year service or delivery contract, And it was so consistently in that range that it was a rounding error and you didn't tend to focus. So the challenge you're going to have in part is some of the contracts have that built in. And the answer is that particularly if it's, if it's cost plus, then maybe there's a way that the system automatically accounts for it. But if it's time and material or a labor-based contract or one where the supply chain is the driver, the vendor's not going to be able to work at those. So I think there's both what do you do about existing contracts, there's provisions and adjustments that contract officers can make, though that depends on the department providing them the resources in order to be able to adjust their program for the higher costs. What it also changes the way you issue future contracts so that you either decide you can project inflation, or for a period of instability, you figure out what is the right metric for the type of contract you're issuing and the type of service you're buying, and build that in, or an adjustable one, like, just for mortgage type of thing, where that there's going to be adjustment, and therefore the vendor doesn't have to price the risk in on top of the cost of the product to be able to insure themselves against that level of uncertainty. The last thing you want to do is encourage people to price in uncertainty when you could have pulled that out of the system. So those are a couple of the tools that I think we have used in the past. And part of that is bringing those back into the system because they've fallen out of use because frankly, they just weren't necessary when everything was stable.
Well, let me make a couple of additional points to that. You're absolutely right, David. We've had such stable, low inflation for so long. One of the dynamics that we see in industry is most contracts no longer have an economic price adjustment clause in them. And without that clause in the contract, it's a lot harder to create the dynamic in which the contractor and the program office and the administrative contracting officers can even enter into a dialogue. But even if they could, you've got a situation where you really can't wrestle with this FY22 inflation issue one contract at a time. I think there are two steps that DOD could take, and I see Eric has his hand up. He probably has a third, fourth, and fifth step. But step number one is actually top-down guidance to the contracting community and to the program offices that they support that says, here's a problem. Here are the tools you have available to deal with it. You don't have to deal with it one contract at a time, and you don't need Mother May I permission if you have the funding available to and the solicitations are sufficient. You can come into play. GSA has essentially done that for contracts on the GSA schedules. They've opened the aperture to multiple requests for equitable adjustment and multiple opportunities for programs to spend the money if they have it. The second thing I think you could do is, this is the time of year that you start the annual sweep ups of unobligated balances, put covering inflation costs for the companies into the mix of what you would use those unobligated balances for. Now, the appropriators may not like that a whole lot because they like those unobligated balances to free up money in FY23, right, to go forward. But if you don't get through 22, 23 is not a problem you're going to fix right now. Eric, additional thoughts you have on that from industry's point of view?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of things. I think one is like the inflationary effect we're all feeling is real, right? I mean, it's just, I think we can't sort of like assume it away. And listen, economics 101, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And we're in an environment where we had massive fiscal stimulus on top of what had been massive monetary stimulus. And then we had supply disruptions from the pandemic. Then we had a second set of supply disruptions from the war in Ukraine. So the system has got to like process a lot of what's going on. And I think it's important to distinguish between what's the short-term, inflationary shock effects we're going to see, and then what's the longer-term inflationary environment that we may be in, right? And the extent you can distinguish between the two, that's important. And I think the third piece is to understand not just the temporal dimension, but the inflationary impacts on different portions of the economy. David, Berteau, you mentioned the wage impact, right? Right now, I know we have manufacturers in the defense industrial base who can't keep manufacturing people employed because they could make as much money going to a fast food restaurant down the street, right? And so that's going to have an upward impact on wages. Nominal wage increases are super, super sticky, right? So if we come out of this period with a significant increase in manufacturing wages, those are going to stick, right? Because that's the way nominal wage rates work, right? Your human capital is your supply chain with feelings. They're going to stay there. But you may see relief on other portions of the economy, whether it's fuel costs or other commodity groups. And so I think that temporal dimension, it's what type of inflationary impacts based on commodity or input that we're seeing, and then also just a recognition that it's real. it's going to take a while for the system to process. And, there needs to be I think to your point too, David, are we making the right budgetary adjustments and inflationary assumptions so that there doesn't end up being a adverse impact on the DoD's purchasing power in the short term as we're trying to figure out where we ultimately land?
Shannon, how does Congress think about this? And in particular, what are the options for a this year fix?
Thanks. So, I was going to kind of comment on David's comments, but also yours, right? So equitable adjustment, right, is something that is a bit of a sticky wicket. We saw that during COVID. David and I had many conversations about how do you help the industrial base address some of these cost escalations that are, short-term, long-term, one-time, recurring. How do you do that? Ultimately, your suggestion of kind of a top-down approach, kind of a scattershot, you can't do it contract by contract, was something that Congress really frowned upon on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, right? That it needed to be done on a case-by-case basis, that we really needed to understand and see the data, that this big, effort to make these adjustments in perpetuity, frankly, or from a broader perspective was something that Congress wasn't particularly fond of. The other thing that I would say is just from a congressional perspective, right, sweeping up, unobligated balances is certainly something that could be negotiated with Congress, as to how you use them. And I know that, I left right before they finished 22, and the inflation issue was something that we tried desperately to address. And while there was a whole lot of money, there wasn't, there's never enough money to do everything. And it wasn't quite quantifiable in order to address it in a way that made the collective comfortable. And I think that that's kind of what you're going to see moving forward for Congress. They want to be helpful, but trying to quantify that is important. I take the point on DDGs, and costs going up and down and being able to do a firm fixed price contract because, the more you make, the more the more efficient you become. But I think right now that's probably, it's a different dynamic, right? Because we have inflation, we have labor shortage. I know that at least for my company, Textron, we go out to suppliers to get a quote to get some, the things that we need, and their quote is good for 24 hours. It doesn't even give us time to go back to the government to then kind of explain, all right, this is why our costs are going to go up. And they're like, 3, 4. Now that may be a game that everybody's playing, but these inflationary pressures are real. And they're caught, in addition to the labor shortages and the people that are working for us have all of the cards, right? And so, right, that's driving costs as well. So I think it's going to be a bit of a different conversation than we've seen in the past, just because I don't think we've ever seen an environment like this where you've got these inflationary pressures, workers, have all of the power to negotiate much higher wages, and then kind of have this supply chain problem. So I think it's just a recurring problem that I think we need to find other more deliberate tools as opposed to just kind of scattershot, like here, go fix it. I think we need to have a deliberate process. And I think that involves DoD and Congress working with the contractors to figure out what that looks like and what they're really seeing.
Well, and for services companies whose assets mostly used to say walk out of the door and go home every night. Now I'm not sure they ever leave home in about 50% of the cases. The lead time for fixing that is essentially zero because you can't spend money on a worker that you're going to, if you lose money on every hour that you work, you're going to go out of business pretty fast. Eric, you had your hand up and then down again. Did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to, I think, just to highlight something Shannon said. I know we're talking about this in the context of the defense industrial base, but we'd be having the exact same conversation if we were an automaker right now, or if we were a consumer electronics company or anything, right? And so, what Shannon had said about the 24-hour quotes, that's true across industries right now. And so I think it's important just for this audience in particular to understand this phenomenon isn't isolated just to DoD. DoD is just having to deal with the effects like every other large industrial enterprise right now globally.
Admiral Lewis, I think we've got about 9 minutes left. you want to do a scatter shot of multiple questions, and then we'll each.
Well,
tackle
actually,
what we can.
there's quite a few questions on the industrial base and supplier base. So I'll try to walk through those kind of top down. I think the highest level question is from Ned Swanson at the AU. Can anyone on the panel share examples of success in rebuilding the industrial base in the continental US towards domestic reliance for defense critical components such as chipset production, specialty metals mining and processing, non-tactical vehicle, automotive parts, small arms ammunition, precursors such as primers. So does anybody have any examples of us onshoring successfully? Over.
The best example I know of was actually the Sematech program, 1989-1991, which invested a chunk of both DPA and appropriated funds, DPA and non-DPA appropriated funds, into helping to integrate the emerging technology into America's domestic chip production base. Not a lot of money, nothing compared to the $52 billion in the China Competes Act, or whatever that act is called these days, or that bill is called these days. But it was a singularly successful story in terms of increasing the percentage of the domestic production capacity at the high end of chips while maintaining what DoD relies more on, which is the two generations or three generations removed chips, because that's what's going into our systems today. It was relatively long-lived until globalization really took root earlier in this century. And it was, I think, a tremendous success story, and the return on investment was phenomenal along the way. I don't think it works today, though. Eric?
Yeah, what I was going to say is I think we're in mid-experimentation on a lot of different fronts around this. Ultimately, what I think the right balance is going to be, it can't just be the department working the supply side and the demand side of the equations are going to have to get met. What I mean by that is, now I'll pick rare earths as an example. You know, we can invest in the processing capability for certain rare earths here, you know, the heavies, let's say. But if we're also not addressing the demand side, you're effectively creating something that won't be competitive globally. And so we have to make sure that as we address the supply side of the equation, we're also making sure they're going to be competitive, or that there's going to be a market for them, at least in the short term, that will then enable sort of the business cases to fully close. You can't address one side or the other.
That's a good point. I should add to my Sematech example, it benefited tremendously from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And so the demand side was pretty dramatically reduced at the same time as we were working the supply side from a commercial point of view. David Norquist or Shannon, any things you want to add to that? All right, Ms. Lewis.
Okay, then the next one is a term I had not heard before, but I think I might like. Ally shoring. In other words, not onshoring into the United States, but onshoring into a close ally as a supplier, part of our industrial base. It says, building on Eric Chewning's comment and the DoD supply chain report, are there ways to use the ally shoring concept to increase capacity, even as nations understandably prioritize their own industrial bases?
Well, Eric, you probably followed the administration's implementation of the Made in America Act and the FAR clause associated with that. It has made some progress in terms of ratcheting up the level of domestic content over several years, up to from 55% today up to 75% in a few years. It does have the exemptions. There's an ally exemption for it. The process by which those exemptions have to be agreed, I believe, takes the head of contracts or the SAE for the military departments presenting a case, and the Made in America office of the White House has to go along with it. That strikes me bureaucratically as not a speedy process, or one through which a lot of approvals can be made. I know there has been one, actually two, but they were both the same issue, decisions already made, but we're going to have to do a little better pace than that going forward. What's your response to that question?
I'm happy to jump in. It looks like Dave Norquist has got some comments too.
Got it.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think it's certainly the right thing to highlight that there's cognitive dissonance to a certain degree when we talk about sort of all these different requirements and how do we get them all integrated in the right way. And I'll throw another one out there, the NTIB, right? The National Technical Industrial Base, which is enshrined in law, around how we get, a shared industrial base across the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom and Canada. And then with the AUKUS framework as another dimension, right? I mean, how are we going to think about special sharing of technologies between those countries? What I'd suggest is I think let's be tactical and pragmatic about it, right? Let's pick certain areas where there's shared interest, and then let's scale that. So, I'll come just be consistent, right? We come back to rare earth capability, right? We know that the security of that supply chain is a concern to the Japanese, the Australians, the Europeans. Is there an opportunity for us to work together on that collectively as we think about sort of creation of that demand profile? I would get really tactical. I'd get really integrated, and I'd treat it like an interagency task force.
David Norquist?
Yeah, I think to build off of that one, I'd also say, the easiest is look at raw materials, right? There's a fundamental difference on a raw material that is dependent on coming out of China and a raw material that comes out of either Australia or Canada. And so when you're looking at where your supply chain risk is, what you're trying to understand is what's the disruption you're protecting against. And in a conflict, for example, which is usually the more dramatic one that DoD focuses on, is what happens if the shooting starts, who's going to still play nice with me? Those make a big difference on what you're willing to accept as non-US supply lines and being able to track that. So I think those are some of the easiest cases. And when I was in the Department of Defense, it was very clear to us there's a difference on the raw materials, where it came from, even before you got to the question of whether the processing was in the United States. So that's the second part that goes with what I think Eric rightfully said, is you look at individual cases to understand what's going on.
I think there's two other aspects that come into play here, Admiral Lewis. One is, the department has a long history of, we have to be prepared to go it alone if we need to, right? And that flies against the idea of let's build the capacity that we need in our allies. And that's both at the front end in terms of development, design, and production, and probably even more so at the back end in terms of sustainment and logistics and support. I would submit that one of the places where we could get the greatest early bang for the buck is at the back end, particularly with respect to China, where both the capacity and the potential capability are there in a number of our allies in a way that they're already buying our stuff. We could build the sustainment and support capacity infrastructure in place. In fact, I would submit that we ought to do that as part of the offset, because it'd be a great way to get the offset without undermining any capacity here. And even the maintenance depots and the shipyards will probably go along with it, because they're chock-a-block right now. They can't absorb any more work as it is, right? And so you'd really complicate Chinese thinking. You'd not only create the ally shoring aspect of it, but you really complicate Chinese thinking with respect to any future content. But until DoD recognizes and accepts the possibility that we're okay depending on those guys, it's an inhibiting factor in the process here. I think we're getting close to the end of time.
I think we have run out of time. So I thank you, David, and I thank all the panelists for your time and effort in preparing. I think we had a good, robust discussion. There are another 10 questions stacked up, so you obviously hit the third rail, so that's good. We'll see if we can't get them to you anyway, but thank you again for your time and your preparation and your insightful comments. This has been an excellent panel.
Well, unlike government witnesses, we're not required to answer questions for the record, but we'll be happy to consider them. I did neglect in my thanks at the beginning, Robert Mortlock and the academic side of the postgraduate school, and I really want to recognize the tremendous support that's given to this program over the years, and particularly for today. Thanks particularly to the panelists. You guys have really stepped up. You made me happy to be here, and I think we've covered a very broad range of topics, and we could have gone much deeper into any one of them. Thank you so much for your time and your effort here, and thanks to the audience for following along.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.